When Carl, a black garbage man in a wealthy neighborhood, finds a strange collection of personal items tossed out by an elderly recluse, his curiosity leads him into a web of forgotten memories and dark secrets. As Carl investigates, he uncovers more than just trash. He finds an old woman abandoned in the house, cryptic letters, and the haunting loneliness of a man who had lived a life of regret. What he discovers will change lives. But it also raises the question, why was everything thrown away? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. The early morning light filtered through the thin veil of clouds, casting a soft glow over the quiet suburban streets. Carl, a tall, lean man in his late 30s, drove his garbage truck through the neighborhood he knew like the back of his hand. His hands gripped the steering wheel with practiced ease, and his eyes scanned the familiar route ahead. The rhythmic hum of the truck's engine was almost soothing in its predictability. Another day, another route. He had done this job for years now, and while it wasn't what he had dreamed of doing, it was honest work. Carl had never been one for complaints. Life hadn't handed him a lot of opportunities, but it had taught him resilience. Growing up in a neighborhood where options were limited, he'd learned to find dignity in whatever he did. And in this job, too, he found purpose, though most people didn't see it that way. They didn't see him at all. He was the invisible man, picking up their refuse, cleaning up after them, and disappearing just as quickly as he arrived. Most days were the same. The streets were lined with pristine houses, perfectly manicured lawns, and shiny cars parked in driveways. But the people inside rarely acknowledged him. If anything, they gave him the briefest nods, a sign of polite distance that barely masked the undercurrent of disdain. Carl had grown used to it. The subtle judgments, the uncomfortable stares, the way they seemed to avert their eyes as if he didn't belong in their world. He had learned to brush it off, but it still stung on occasion. He couldn't help but wonder how things would be different if the color of his skin matched the color of the hands that handed him those stares. Carl was no stranger to prejudice. It had been a part of his life since childhood, and in this neighborhood, it was always present in some form or another. Yet, he remained proud. He did his job with care, knowing that without people like him, the world would crumble under its own weight. As Carl pulled the truck to a stop outside one of the grander homes on the block, he took a moment to look around. It was an elderly white man's house, Mr. Thompson. The man was a recluse, rarely seen outside his home, and when he did appear, he walked with a stiff gait, hunched over from years of living. Carl had seen him a few times, but never exchanged more than a passing glance. Mr. Thompson didn't seem like the kind of man who welcomed conversation. The trash was usually the same every week, a small bin, almost empty, filled with nothing but the barest essentials. The man lived alone, after all, and from what Carl had gathered, he had no family nearby. But today was different. As Carl approached the trash bin, he noticed it was overflowing. The lid was barely able to close, and something large and bulky was stuffed inside. His brow furrowed. It was unusual, to say the least. Mr. Thompson's trash was always sparse, neat, and orderly. Carl stared at the bin for a moment, debating whether he should just grab it and move on. It wasn't his job to questions. His job was to take the trash, dump it in the truck, and keep moving. Still, something gnawed at him. Curiosity mixed with a vague sense of unease. It wasn't like him to pry, but there was something off about this. He couldn't shake the feeling. He crouched down, peering into the bin. The black garbage bags inside were hastily wrapped, as if someone had thrown them together in a hurry. Carl reached out, hesitated, then gently pulled at the edge of one of the bags. At first glance, the contents didn't seem too unusual. Papers, boxes, some old books. But as he dug a little deeper, he noticed something else. Photographs. Family photographs. Carl paused, frowning. These didn't belong in the trash. The pictures were old, faded, but they were clearly important. He pulled one out, holding it up to the light. It showed a much younger Mr. Thompson, standing beside a woman who must have been his wife, and 2 young children. They looked happy, frozen in a moment of time that had long passed. Carl glanced around, making sure no one was watching. He knew he shouldn't be doing this, going through someone's trash, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. These weren't things that were usually thrown away. Who throws out their memories like this? As Carl sifted through more of the trash, he found letters. Some sealed, some opened. He couldn't help but wonder what they said. Were they love letters? Were they goodbyes? What had happened in Mr. Thompson's life that made him decide to get rid of these pieces of his past? Carl's mind raced with questions. He knew he should stop, put the trash back, and continue his route. But the more he uncovered, the more he felt like something was wrong. Had something happened to Mr. Thompson? Was this a sign of distress? The man lived alone, and Carl hadn't seen him in days. Was he sick? Hurt? His instincts told him to knock on the door and check, but another part of him warned against it. What if it wasn't his place? What if it was just a misunderstanding? Carl had learned the hard way that people were often suspicious of his intentions, especially in a neighborhood like this. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He glanced back at the truck, then at the house. A decision had to be made. Carl wasn't one to meddle, but he couldn't ignore the knot in his stomach. What if this was his only chance to help? What if Mr. Thompson was in real trouble? His heart raced as he pulled out his phone. He hesitated for a moment, thumb hovering over the screen, before dialing 911. As the phone rang, Carl's mind spun with 1,000 thoughts. How would they react to his call? What if they didn't take him seriously? What if they assumed the worst about him, simply because of where he was and what he looked like? The operator's voice broke through his thoughts, calm and professional, as she asked for details. "I'm at one of my stops, and I think something might be wrong with the homeowner," Carl explained, trying to keep his voice steady. "I found some things in the trash that don't seem right, and I haven't seen him in a few days. He's an older man, lives alone." The operator asked for the address, and Carl gave it to her, hoping he was doing the right thing. As he waited for help to arrive, he glanced back at the house, wondering what he'd just set in motion. The minutes stretched on like hours, as Carl stood by the garbage truck, his gaze fixed on Mr. Thompson's house. The rhythmic ticking of the truck's engine was the only sound in the stillness of the suburban street. Carl felt a tightness in his chest, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. Did he do the right thing by calling the authorities? What if it was nothing? Just an old man clearing out his past? What if he was overreacting? But then again, what if something really was wrong? Carl had never been one to meddle in other people's business. He knew his place, or at least he had been taught to know it. In this neighborhood, where people barely acknowledged his presence, stepping out of line, even with good intentions, could lead to all sorts of complications. But today felt different. The strange trash, the old photographs, the letters. It didn't add up. As Carl stood there lost in thought, he saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching. His heart skipped a beat, a mixture of relief and anxiety flooding through him. He had dealt with police before, sometimes in harmless encounters, other times not so much. He knew how things could quickly escalate, how a simple situation could be misconstrued because of who he was and where he was standing. He took a deep breath and straightened his posture, hoping this wouldn't turn into one of those days. The police car pulled up in front of Mr. Thompson's house, and 2 officers stepped out. One of them, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, approached Carl while the other hung back near the car. Carl's pulse quickened as he noticed the officer sizing him up, his eyes scanning Carl's uniform, then flicking to the garbage truck. There was a moment of silence before the officer spoke. "Did you make the call?" the officer asked, his voice steady but guarded. "Yeah, that was me," Carl replied, trying to keep his tone calm and respectful. He didn't want to give the wrong impression. "I'm the garbage man. I found some things in the trash that seemed unusual, and I haven't seen Mr. Thompson in a while. He's an older guy, lives alone, so I thought maybe something might be wrong." The officer's expression remained neutral, but Carl could feel the judgment in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The unspoken suspicion, the cautious distance. Carl had encountered it enough times to recognize it. Still, he pressed on, explaining what he had found in the bin, the photographs, the letters, the sense that something wasn't right. The officer nodded slowly, though his eyes never fully softened. "All right," he said. "We'll check it out." Carl watched as the two officers approached Mr. Thompson's front door. They knocked a few times, the sound echoing in the stillness of the morning. No response. They knocked again, this time more forcefully, but still nothing. One of the officers glanced back at Carl, then exchanged a look with his partner. "Mr. Thompson?" One of the officers called out, rapping on the door a third time. "This is the police. Are you home?" The silence that followed was heavy. Carl felt a growing sense of dread creeping up his spine. What if something had happened to the old man? He didn't know Mr. Thompson well, had barely spoken to him in all the years he'd been collecting his trash, but the idea of something bad happening and no one noticing weighed on him. The officers finally decided to enter. Carl watched from a distance as they carefully turned the doorknob, finding it unlocked. They stepped inside, leaving the door ajar. For a few moments, nothing happened. Carl stood frozen in place, unsure of what to expect. His mind raced with possibilities. What if Mr. Thompson was hurt? What if he was sick, lying somewhere in the house, unable to call for help? Then, one of the officers appeared at the door again, waving over to Carl. "Hey, can you come here for a second?" Carl's stomach twisted into a knot. Why were they calling him? Was something wrong? He wiped his hands on his uniform, trying to steady his nerves, and made his way toward the house. As he approached, he noticed the officer standing just inside the doorway, his face tense but composed. "We found Mr. Thompson inside," the officer explained. "He's unconscious, but still breathing. Paramedics are on their way." Carl's heart sank. Unconscious? He wasn't sure what he had expected, but hearing that the old man was in such a state hit him harder than he thought it would. Despite their lack of interaction, Carl had always seen Mr. Thompson as part of the backdrop of his daily life, a fixture in the neighborhood. The idea of something happening to him, something serious, felt strangely personal. "What happened?" Carl asked, his voice low. "We're not sure yet," the officer replied. "It looks like he might have fallen, or maybe had some kind of medical episode. His house is in disarray. Papers and photographs everywhere, like he was going through his things. Could be a sign of something more, but we'll leave that for the paramedics to determine." Carl nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He hadn't known Mr. Thompson well, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something far more significant than he had anticipated. The photographs, the letters, they weren't just random items tossed into the trash. They were pieces of the man's life, fragments of a story that Carl had inadvertently become a part of. As Carl stood in the doorway, he glanced into the house, his eyes falling on the scattered papers and personal belongings. There was a certain sadness in the way things were strewn about, as if Mr. Thompson had been trying to make sense of his life, only to be interrupted by something beyond his control. Carl wondered if the old man had been feeling lonely, if he had been trying to clear away the past or leave something behind for someone to find. The sound of sirens approaching snapped Carl out of his thoughts. The paramedics arrived, rushing into the house with their equipment. Carl stepped aside, watching as they quickly assessed Mr. Thompson's condition and prepared to transport him to the hospital. Everything moved in a blur, the paramedics, the officers, the sense of urgency filling the air. As they wheeled Mr. Thompson out on a stretcher, Carl found himself standing alone by the door. The old man looked frail, his skin pale against the crisp white sheets. Carl felt a strange tug at his heart. He had never expected to care so much about a man he barely knew, but here he was, feeling the weight of it all. The officers gave Carl a nod as they followed the paramedics out. "You did the right thing by calling us," one of them said. "We'll follow up with you if we need any more information." Carl nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. As the ambulance pulled away, Carl felt a strange mix of relief and unease. He had done what he could, but now the situation was out of his hands. All he could do was hope that Mr. Thompson would recover, and that whatever had been going on in the old man's life, it wasn't too late to fix it. With a heavy heart, Carl returned to his truck, the familiar routine feeling distant and unimportant. He started the engine, but before he pulled away, he took one last look at the house. Something had shifted today, something he couldn't quite put into words. And as he drove off, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much deeper story. The low hum of the garbage truck's engine filled the silence as Carl drove away from Mr. Thompson's house. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white as he replayed the morning's events in his mind. What had started as a normal day, another routine route in the same quiet neighborhood, had turned into something much more unsettling. The image of Mr. Thompson, pale and unconscious, lingered in Carl's thoughts like a ghost he couldn't shake. He had done the right thing by calling for help, but now he was left with more questions than answers. The rest of his shift passed in a blur. The repetitive motions of his work, collecting bins, dumping trash, moving on to the next house, felt mechanical, almost robotic. His mind kept drifting back to the scene at Mr. Thompson's house, to the scattered papers and photographs he had glimpsed inside. Who was that man, really? And why had he thrown away pieces of his life so carelessly? By the time Carl finished his route, the sun was already dipping low on the horizon. The fading light cast long shadows across the streets, giving the neighborhood an eerie, unfamiliar quality. As he parked the truck at the depot and punched out for the day, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. Normally, he would head straight home, grab a quick dinner, and unwind in front of the television. But tonight was different. Tonight, his thoughts were consumed by the mystery he had stumbled upon. After changing out of his work uniform and into a clean pair of jeans and a simple t-shirt, Carl found himself standing in front of his car, debating his next move. He didn't have any real reason to go back to Mr. Thompson's house. The police and paramedics had handled everything, and Mr. Thompson was now in the care of the hospital. But Carl couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of his mind, the one that kept telling him there was more to the story, something left unsaid. With a sigh, Carl climbed into his car and started the engine. He didn't have a plan, but he figured he would drive by the house, just to see if anything had changed. Maybe the police had returned to investigate further, or maybe Mr. Thompson's family had shown up, or maybe Carl was just chasing shadows. As he pulled onto the familiar street, the neighborhood was quiet as always. The houses stood tall and proud, their windows glowing softly in the twilight. But when Carl approached Mr. Thompson's house, he noticed something unexpected. There was no sign of the police or anyone else. The house looked exactly as it had that morning, as though nothing had happened at all. The front door was closed, the curtains drawn, and the only light came from the porch, casting a dim halo over the entrance. Carl parked his car a short distance away and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. It felt strange to be here, out of uniform, without the cover of his usual work routine. He felt exposed, like he was intruding on someone's private world. But he couldn't help himself. Something about the whole situation gnawed at him, pulling him back. After a few moments of hesitation, Carl stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. His footsteps were quiet on the pavement, and he glanced around to make sure no one was watching. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself. As he reached the front porch, he stood still for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorbell. He had no idea what he was expecting. An answer? A sign? But the house remained silent, offering no clues. Carl's gaze drifted to the side of the house, where the trash bins were still neatly lined up against the wall. He remembered the photographs and letters he had found earlier that day, and before he could stop himself, he found his feet carrying him toward the bins once again. Part of him felt ridiculous. What was he hoping to find? But another part of him knew that whatever answers he was seeking were connected to what Mr. Thompson had thrown away. The bin lid creaked as Carl lifted it, and inside he saw the same collection of bags he had discovered that morning. The photographs were still there, along with the letters and other personal items. Carl reached in, gingerly pulling out one of the photos. This one showed Mr. Thompson as a much younger man, standing in front of a large, stately house with a woman by his side. His wife, Carl assumed. They looked happy, the kind of happiness that came from years of shared memories. Carl turned the photo over, hoping to find some kind of clue, a date, a name, something to help him understand why Mr. Thompson had discarded this piece of his past. But the back of the photo was blank. He placed it carefully back into the bin and pulled out one of the letters. The envelope was yellowed with age, the edges frayed, as though it had been handled many times before. Carl hesitated for a moment, then opened it. The handwriting was neat but shaky, as if written by someone in a hurry, or perhaps in the midst of strong emotion. Carl's eyes scanned the first few lines, and his heart skipped a beat as the words began to reveal a deeper story. Dear Robert, I don't know how to say this, but I need to tell you the truth about what happened all those years ago. I know I should have told you sooner, but I was too scared of what it might mean for us, for our family. I hope you can forgive me for keeping this from you. Carl's breath caught in his throat. The letter was addressed to Mr. Thompson. Robert, he realized. But the writer, who were they? And what was this secret they were confessing? Carl's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of a story that seemed more and more complicated with every new discovery. He carefully folded the letter back into the envelope and placed it back in the bin. His hands were trembling slightly as he closed the lid. This was too much. He had already intruded more than he should have, and now he felt like he was carrying the weight of someone else's burden. A burden he hadn't asked for but couldn't seem to let go of. As Carl turned to leave, he heard a faint sound, a door creaking open. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, he turned to see the front door of Mr. Thompson's house slightly ajar. For a moment, he wondered if someone had come back, but the house remained quiet. No footsteps, no voices, just the door, hanging open, as if inviting him in. Carl stood there, unsure of what to do. Every instinct told him to leave, to walk away from this strange and unsettling situation. But something else, something deeper, pulled him forward. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like he was on the edge of uncovering something important. Something that went beyond Mr. Thompson's trash, beyond the letters and photographs. Something that might explain why the old man had thrown his life into the bin. Taking a deep breath, Carl stepped toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest. He reached out, gently pushing it open a little wider. The inside of the house was dimly lit, the air thick with the musty smell of old wood and dust. Carl hesitated at the threshold, unsure if he was crossing a line he wouldn't be able to come back from. But as he stood there, peering into the darkness, he realized that he had already crossed that line hours ago, when he first opened the bin and looked inside. There was no turning back now. Carl stood frozen at the entrance to Mr. Thompson's house, his mind spinning with uncertainty. The door creaked softly as it swung open wider, as if inviting him in. The soft hum of the night outside only intensified the eerie stillness of the home, making the air feel heavy. Carl's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this was a line he shouldn't cross, yet something deep inside told him that the answers he sought were in this house. The urge to understand what had happened to Mr. Thompson, why the old man had seemingly thrown away pieces of his past, was too strong to ignore. With one last glance around the neighborhood, Carl stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. The house was dimly lit by a single lamp in the living room, casting long shadows across the floor. As Carl's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could see that the disarray he had glimpsed earlier was even worse than he'd imagined. Papers, photographs, and old belongings were scattered everywhere, as if a storm had blown through the house. Carl moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything. He felt like an intruder in someone else's life, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to be here, that he was being drawn into this story for a reason. He stepped over a pile of old books, his eyes scanning the room for any clues that might help him make sense of the situation. On the coffee table, he spotted a half-empty glass of water and a bottle of pills, their label too far away to read clearly. His heart sank. Had Mr. Thompson been ill? Was that why he had collapsed? Carl felt a pang of guilt. He had never really thought about the old man's life, about the possibility that he might have been struggling in silence, just as invisible to the world as Carl often felt in his own job. The house creaked with age, the kind of sound that made Carl feel like he wasn't alone. He glanced nervously around the room, half expecting someone to appear from the shadows. But there was no one, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the next room and the faint ticking of an old wall clock. Carl's eyes landed on a small stack of papers on the arm of the couch. He recognized them immediately. More letters, like the one he had found in the trash. His curiosity flared again, stronger now. These letters seemed to hold the key to whatever secret Mr. Thompson had been keeping. Maybe, just maybe, they would explain why he had thrown away so much of his life. He picked up one of the letters, carefully unfolding it. The handwriting was the same, neat but shaky, as if written by someone whose hands trembled with age or emotion. Carl began to read. Robert, I've tried to make peace with it, but the guilt never goes away. You never knew the full story, and I don't think I can live with that any longer. I hope you can forgive me. Carl's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just any letter. This was a confession. He scanned the rest of the page, his mind racing with questions. What had Mr. Thompson been hiding? What had happened in his past that had filled him with such regret? As Carl read on, the letter's tone became more desperate, more pleading. It was clear that whoever had written this had been carrying the weight of something heavy for a long time. Carl folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the pile. His head was swimming with possibilities. Mr. Thompson wasn't just an old man living alone. He was someone with a past, with secrets and regrets that had haunted him for years. And somehow, Carl had found himself entangled in those secrets, a bystander who had stumbled into the middle of a story he never expected to be part of. As Carl stood there lost in thought, a sudden sound broke the silence, the soft creak of floorboards behind him. His heart jumped into his throat, and he spun around, expecting to see someone standing there. But the room was empty. Carl's pulse raced as he scanned the house again, his nerves on edge. He was about to convince himself that it was just the house settling, nothing more, when he heard it again, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper of movement. Carl took a cautious step forward, his eyes darting around the room. The sound was coming from the hallway that led to the back of the house. His hands were trembling, but he couldn't stop himself from moving toward it, drawn by the same force that had brought him inside in the first place. The hallway was narrow and dark, the walls lined with faded family portraits. Carl's eyes flicked to each one as he passed, noting the solemn faces, the moments captured in time. At the end of the hallway was a closed door. Carl hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct told him to turn around, to leave this place and never look back. But something kept him rooted to the spot, the weight of Mr. Thompson's untold story pressing down on him. With a deep breath, Carl turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room inside was small and cluttered, with more papers and belongings strewn across the floor. But what caught Carl's attention immediately was the figure sitting in the corner, hunched over in a worn armchair. For a split second, Carl's heart stopped. Had he found Mr. Thompson here, still in the house after all? But as he stepped closer, he realized it wasn't Mr. Thompson. It was someone else entirely. The figure was an elderly woman, her white hair thin and wispy, her skin pale and translucent in the dim light. She was staring out the window, her eyes vacant, as if lost in a world far removed from the present. Carl's mind raced. Who was she? How long had she been here? And why hadn't anyone mentioned her when they had found Mr. Thompson earlier? "Ma'am?" Carl said softly, unsure of how to approach her. "Are you okay?" The woman didn't respond. She didn't even turn her head. Carl took a cautious step closer, his hands trembling again. There was something haunting about the way she sat there, so still, so disconnected from everything around her. He had the sudden, unsettling realization that she had been there the whole time, while the police had been in the house, while the paramedics had taken Mr. Thompson away. No one had noticed her. No one had seen her. Carl's voice cracked as he spoke again, louder this time. "Ma'am, do you need help?" Finally, the woman stirred. Her head turned slowly, and her eyes met Carl's. For a moment there was nothing, no recognition, no emotion. But then her lips parted, and in a voice so soft it was barely a whisper, she said, "He left me." Carl's heart sank. The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Whoever this woman was, she had been abandoned, left alone in this house, forgotten by the world. Carl felt a surge of compassion for her, for the loneliness and pain that radiated from her in waves. "Who left you?" Carl asked gently, kneeling down beside her. "Who are you talking about?" The woman's gaze drifted back to the window, her voice distant and far away. "Robert," she said. "He left me." Carl's mind raced. Robert, Mr. Thompson. This woman was talking about him. But what did she mean? Had Mr. Thompson left her here? Had he abandoned her? The questions piled up in Carl's mind, but the answers remained elusive. For a long moment, Carl sat in silence, unsure of what to do. The woman seemed so fragile, so lost in her own world, that he didn't want to overwhelm her with questions. But he couldn't leave her here. Not like this. She needed help, real help, not just the kind that came with paramedics and police. "I'm going to get someone to help you," Carl said softly. "You're not alone." The woman didn't respond. She simply stared out the window, her mind far away. Carl stood up slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had discovered. This house was more than just a place. It was a prison of loneliness and regret. And the more Carl learned, the more he realized that he had stumbled onto something much bigger than he had ever imagined. As Carl made his way back down the hallway, he felt the weight of the old woman's words pressing down on him. "He left me." The mystery surrounding Mr. Thompson and his discarded life was deeper than Carl had thought. And now, he was a part of it. Carl left the house with his heart heavier than when he had entered. The old woman's hollow words echoed in his mind. "He left me." He had come to understand that this wasn't just about Mr. Thompson throwing away old memories. It wasn't about forgotten letters or discarded photographs. The situation was far more complex than he could have ever anticipated, and now it involved an elderly woman, seemingly abandoned and lost in her own home. He sat in his car for a few minutes, trying to gather his thoughts. The darkness outside seemed to close in around him as he replayed the day's events in his mind. What had started as a gut feeling, a simple suspicion that something wasn't right with the trash Mr. Thompson had left out, had turned into a tangled web of loneliness, regret, and unresolved issues. But Carl couldn't shake the feeling that this story was far from over. With a deep breath, Carl pulled out his phone and called the police again. He didn't know what else to do. The woman needed help, and this time he wasn't going to leave it to chance. When the operator picked up, Carl explained the situation carefully, his voice steady but urgent. He described the elderly woman he had found in Mr. Thompson's house, her state of mind, and her cryptic words about being left behind. Within minutes, the police were on their way. Carl stayed in his car, watching the house as though expecting something else to emerge from its shadowed windows. When the police arrived, he gave them a quick rundown of everything that had happened since that morning. The discovery of the strange trash, Mr. Thompson's collapse, and now the mysterious woman who seemed to be living in a world of her own. The officers listened intently, their faces serious. They had already been to this house once today, and now they were back for reasons they couldn't have anticipated. Carl accompanied them inside, showing them to the room where the woman still sat, staring out of the window, unmoving. The officer spoke to her gently, trying to coax her into responding, but she barely acknowledged their presence. Carl stood back, watching as the professionals took over, a sense of relief washing over him. At least she was in safe hands now. After what felt like hours, the paramedics arrived again, this time to take the woman to the hospital for evaluation. Carl watched as they lifted her gently from the chair and placed her on a stretcher, the woman's vacant eyes never leaving the window. As they wheeled her out of the house, Carl felt a tug of sadness. The old woman had been forgotten, just as Mr. Thompson had been. But perhaps now, things could begin to change. Once the paramedics had left, one of the police officers approached Carl. "You've done a good thing here today," the officer said, his tone softer than it had been earlier. "We'll look into her situation, see if we can contact any family or get her the help she needs. You've probably saved her life." Carl nodded, though the weight of the day still pressed down on him. "I just hope she's okay. And Mr. Thompson too," he added, glancing back at the house. "There's more going on here than just some old trash." The officer gave him a thoughtful look. "We'll make sure to follow up with both of them. It's possible the woman is Mr. Thompson's wife or a relative. Sometimes people fall through the cracks, you know. But now, thanks to you, we can make sure they're not forgotten." Carl thanked the officer and made his way back to his car. As he drove home, the streets felt quieter than usual. The weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders. His thoughts drifted between the frail old man, the cryptic letters, and the elderly woman left in the house. There was a deep loneliness in both of them, a loneliness that Carl couldn't help but feel on some level too. When he got home, Carl collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. It was strange how a single day could change so much. He had always gone through his routine with a sense of detachment, treating the people whose trash he collected as distant figures he barely noticed. But today he had become part of their lives, part of their pain, their regrets. It wasn't something he had asked for, but it was something he couldn't ignore. Days passed, and Carl couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Thompson and the old woman. He found himself driving by the house on his route, slowing down to glance at the windows, hoping to see some sign of life, some indication that things were getting better. But the house remained quiet, its secrets hidden behind drawn curtains and empty rooms. Then one morning, as Carl was nearing the end of his route, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. A car was parked in Mr. Thompson's driveway, and standing beside it was a man and a woman, both in their late 40s, talking quietly. Carl pulled the truck to a stop and watched as the man opened the trunk and began unloading boxes. It was clear they were here for Mr. Thompson's things. Carl hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to approach them. But something told him this was his chance to understand what had really happened. He climbed out of the truck and walked over, offering a small nod as he approached. "Hey," Carl said, keeping his tone friendly. "I'm the garbage man. I've been working this route for years. I heard about what happened to Mr. Thompson. How is he doing?" The man looked up, surprised at first, but then his expression softened. "He's stable," the man said slowly. "They're keeping him in the hospital for now. My sister and I just flew in to take care of things, get the house in order. It's been a while since we've been in touch." Carl nodded, feeling a pang of sadness at the man's words. "I didn't mean to pry. I just found some things in the trash that didn't seem right. It made me wonder if he was okay." The man exchanged a glance with his sister before looking back at Carl. "I appreciate you looking out for him," he said, his voice sincere. "Dad's had a rough few years. Mom passed away a while back, and he hasn't been the same since. He didn't tell us things were getting this bad. We should have been paying more attention." Carl's heart sank at the mention of Mr. Thompson's wife. The old woman he had found in the house, had she been a ghost of Mr. Thompson's grief? A manifestation of the loneliness he had been living with for so long? Carl wasn't sure, but he felt a deep sadness for the old man, who had been trying to make sense of a life that had crumbled around him. "I hope he gets better," Carl said softly. "I really do." The man nodded, his expression somber. "Thank you. We'll do our best to make sure he's taken care of from now on. It's never easy when you realize you've let someone slip through the cracks." Carl offered a small smile before turning to leave. As he walked back to the truck, he felt a sense of closure, though it was tinged with sadness. Mr. Thompson's life had been a long, winding road filled with regrets, and Carl had only seen a small part of it. But in that small part, he had made a difference. He had helped in the only way he knew how. As Carl drove away, he felt lighter somehow. The world around him hadn't changed, but maybe, just maybe, he had. He had learned that sometimes the smallest actions, a phone call, a second glance, a bit of curiosity, could make all the difference. People weren't just their outward appearances or the contents of their trash bins. They were complex, with lives full of memories, regrets, and untold stories. And in the end, Carl realized we all just wanted to be seen. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.